Aram, what a pleasure to be with you today to talk about your book. You know, I looked at its cover and I was immediately intrigued by it. Some say you can't judge a book by its cover, but let's start by judging this book by its cover. Tell me about the cover. What's on it?
Well, thank you, Rich. Thanks for having me. So it was actually quite a struggle to pick the perfect image for the cover. It is a picture from the last day of the march, June 26, 1966, as the leaders lead the march, the final leg of the Meredith March, into Jackson, Mississippi. And it was kind of a struggle to pick the right picture because on the one hand, you wanted to capture the sweep of the march. You wanted to capture its human element. You wanted to capture just the many, many people who were part of this long 3-week civil rights demonstration that started in Memphis and ended in Jackson. On the other hand, you wanted to make sure that you highlighted some of the key figures in the march, the main leaders. And that includes Martin Luther King, it includes Stokely Carmichael, and it includes the quixotic man who started the whole thing, James Meredith. And this image was lucky enough to capture all three of those, as well as a whole sweep of marchers along with them.
Fantastic. Let's backtrack a bit. Tell us about the march you're referring to. Tell us about the title of the book and how you chose it.
Sure. So the title is Down to the Crossroads, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear. And it is a civil rights march that begins in Memphis at the beginning of June of 1966 and ends 3 weeks later in Jackson. And in those 3 weeks, you could make an argument that the civil rights movement in many ways transforms, that it approaches its crossroads, right? The call for black power is first heard on the Meredith March Against Fear. Stokely Carmichael unveils that slogan, if you will, midway through the march. And it immediately generates controversy. It immediately generates a great swelling of enthusiasm among many local black people. And in a lot of ways, it ignites a new direction in black politics. Now, those changes might have happened over the course of time anyway, but what the Meredith March did was it dramatized this shift. Because it brought together civil rights leaders and regular people, white and black, from all across the country, and put them into this sort of laboratory of black politics as it moved through Mississippi. It created all these really dramatic moments that highlighted some of the key divisions and some of the key tensions, but also some of the key strengths that had long animated the civil rights movement.
Speaking of dramatizing the march, a lot of people of my generation, especially black people, our parents will say, you should be grateful for this, you know, we marched, and then we tease them behind their back and we call them bunions narratives because they're always complaining about the bunions they got, marching for things that we enjoy now. But take us there, dramatize the march for us, for people who weren't there firsthand. What was it like? This particular march and civil rights marches in general.
Well, if you're talking about just this pure physical act of marching, I mean, one of the marchers that I interviewed, she talked about how sort of a status symbol of a real marcher was they had what was called ventilated tennis shoes. In other words, they walked for so many miles that there were holes in their tennis shoes. And you were talking about June in Mississippi on a hot, open highway. So just the physical rigor of being part of this march, marching somewhere between anywhere from, say, 8 to 15 miles in a day. And there are some diehards who did it for most of those 3 weeks. So if you just want to talk about sort of the physical aspect of it, it could be quite rigorous. Now, mix that in with camping at night, mix that in with dealing with the fears about a possible attack from hostile whites, mix in the many demonstrations that were held along the way, rallies for voter registration, and then mix in some of the violence that they encountered. Especially in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Canton, Mississippi. And what you've got is just a whole host of dramatic moments.
And in these dramatic moments, a lot of folks tend to be familiar with the Selma March on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But this march in particular, how did it begin, and who was the main protagonist?
So it's a unique story in the sense that it really begins in the mind and in the actions of one man, and that is James Meredith. Now, James Meredith is famous for integrating the University of Mississippi in 1962, causing the so-called Ole Miss crisis, when he was the first African-American to attend this bastion of white privilege. It led to severe resistance from white authorities, pretty much prompted a federal constitutional crisis for the Kennedy administration to ultimately call in the National Guard after not doing so at first. It was a great riot. 2 people died within that riot. And Meredith spent a year at Ole Miss before he graduated in incredible isolation and faced incredible hardship under constant protection from federal marshals. And much of that began, again, in his mind. He was a very singular individual man. He wasn't someone who associated himself necessarily with a larger movement. but he was very determined at the same time to try to combat what he saw as institutions of white supremacy. But after Ole Miss, Meredith kind of drifts off the radar screen for a while. He struggles to find his place in this larger struggle. He spent some time in Washington, D.C. He accepts a fellowship to Nigeria, a 3-year fellowship that he abandons after 1 year. He enrolls in Columbia Law School, but he has an eye on a larger political career. And he envisions this march, what really begins as a single man's walk from Memphis to Jackson. He sees it as having a number of goals. One is to encourage people to register to vote, encourage African Americans to register to vote. The Voting Rights Act had been passed the previous year, and that was starting to stimulate the beginnings of some mass voter registration in Mississippi. But still, for your ordinary black person in Mississippi, they realized that going to the courthouse, registering to vote, actually casting a ballot, that could be accompanied by serious danger, the loss of credit, all sorts of reprisals from whites. The other aspect of Meredith's goal was what he called it a walk against fear. So he saw, the goal of voter registration tied into this battle against this culture of fear. And he also had a personal ambition that was beneath that as well, and that is that he saw this as a chance to sort of resuscitate his career, as a chance to build a political following, and ultimately run for office in Mississippi in this new dawning age of black politics. On the second day of his march, he has just come through Hernando, Mississippi, the first town along his route in Mississippi. He's left Memphis the day before. He's in Hernando, and he gets a nice warm reception from about 150 people there who say that they're going to register to vote and encourage him. And he tells stories of these old African American men who'd been so intimidated by the powerful whites in the town for so long, but now defying them, now standing up, and even as hostile whites are glaring at them from across the town square, they still support Meredith. So he sees himself as sort of just beginning to achieve his personal vision for what this walk can be. Then a few miles south of Hernando, he continues his walk. He's going down this sort of dipping stretch of road. And there are Mississippi State policemen, the Mississippi Highway Patrol. There's a few FBI agents on the march. There's local police. But none of them stop a man from jumping out of the woods and shooting James Meredith, firing 3 shots and peppering him with birdshot, scattered pellets into his skin. So Meredith is wounded, and all of a sudden this becomes a huge national story. The march had gotten a little bit of attention when it was just James Meredith, but as soon as he's shot, that image is plastered on the front page of every newspaper in America, and it reaches international audiences, and it becomes a big rallying cry among the civil rights establishment to pass more civil rights legislation. It causes all sorts of excitement and tension in black neighborhoods throughout the country, from Harlem to the south side of Chicago, Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee. And what began now as one man's walk gets transformed into an extravaganza, where basically every major civil rights organization just descends upon Memphis, determined to carry on James Meredith's walk through Mississippi.
Because what inspired them to join that hadn't inspired them before? What was the difference?
Everyone saw the original walk as just sort of James Meredith's solitary endeavor. He had not invited the participation of any major civil rights organizations. He said, you could come follow me if you want, but you have to be a man. He had sort of this hierarchical, patriarchal view, and you have to be independent. This isn't a big march that is going to impose on local communities. We're not going to try to raise a to-do and then leave people vulnerable to violence. You have to be a man. You have to be independent. You got to be willing to move in small groups, and that's the only way this walk is going to work. So it wasn't a walk that invited mass participation. But once Martin Luther King is there, right? Once the NAACP and CORE and SNCC and SCLC and all the major civil rights organizations come, then it becomes, it's almost like a chance to replicate the success of Selma from the previous year.
And Meredith did not die, correct? What became of him?
So Meredith was wounded. He didn't die. When he was shot, there was a misinterpretation in the news, and the AP reporter put out a bulletin that he had died, and this caused even more hysteria, as you might imagine, throughout the country. But quickly that was dispelled. So Meredith was wounded, and he ended up recuperating through most of the march. He was in New York, so there's all these organizations marching in his name, right? All these people marching in his name, and it has his somewhat. He accepts that's occurring, right? He gave it on some level as a blessing, but at the same time, for those 3 weeks, Meredith is exceptionally frustrated because the march has diverged from his vision. It's become the mass march that he didn't want, right? He saw it as being sort of centered around him as an individual and his ideas for how to combat white supremacy. And now it's become a mass, nonviolent march starring Martin Luther King with lots of federal attention and lots of media attention and lots of impact on the local communities, which is what Meredith had been concerned about.
And part of what I love about this book is your colorful